All right, y'all. Good morning or afternoon, whenever you're watching this. I'm going to help out Mr. Miner here a little bit and record you an econ lecture to kind of keep you moving along here. Because this next topic is actually really important. Most of Unit 3 is all connected in topic 3.5 and 3.6. So understanding this topic will be really important to getting the Unit 3 test correct. So we want to kind of take all of the graphs we've been looking at this unit so far and put them all together. And we're going to look at what the aggregate demand and aggregate supply model looks like when we combine it all. So that's sort of our plan for today. We're going to put AD and AS together. So one of the things you might remember from a past unit is that the economy can only be in three places at any given time, right? If we're talking macroeconomics and we're thinking of like the business cycle, essentially there are only three places the economy can be. So let's take a second to review what those three places are. So if you were to take all three of the graphs we've studied so far, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and LRAS, the long run aggregate supply, if you graphed them on the same graph like this, it would look something like this, right? So we can combine all three of these together because you'll notice their axes are the same. Price level is always on the y-axis for all of these graphs, and real GDP, or the size of the economy, is always on the horizontal axis, the x-axis. So we can graph all three of them together and use them to represent the three states of the economy. So when we put these three together, we get what is called the aggregate demand or aggregate supply model, which is also known as the ADAS model. And so what you have to remember is that this is essentially like if we took all of the supply and demand curves for individual products, right? So rather than being the supply and demand for pizza, this graph is the supply and demand for everything. Aggregate demand is just the total of all the stuff that people demand in the economy. And aggregate supply is the total of everything that is supplied in the economy. It's a little different in the short run and the long run, which is why we have two aggregate supply graphs, but we'll kind of touch on that more as we get a little bit later in the unit. So if you look at this graph, it represents the current state of the economy. So this is our way of measuring what is the economy doing, right? So the three states of the economy as represented on this graph. You might remember that there are essentially three places the economy can be at any given time, and we represented these with the business cycle in Unit 2. So we have full employment, where our potential GDP is at and our actual GDP are the same. We can be above that, which would put us in a positive output gap, or what is called an inflationary gap, or you can be in a negative output gap, which is called a recessionary gap. So we'll go back and talk about what each of those three things mean here right now. So full employment is when aggregate demand and aggregate supply are crossing at the long run aggregate supply. Long run aggregate supply is going to represent our full employment level. So if we are using all of our resources efficiently and sustainably, we're at that sweet spot for the economy. We are living up to all of our potential GDP without overdoing any of our resources. This is where we want to be. This is our sweet spot for the economy. So as a general rule, if we're not here, the government's job is going to be to intervene to try to help get us back to this point. So if we're not at full employment, we have to figure out how can we adjust the economy by moving one of these curves in order to get us back at full employment. If we could stay here all the time, that would be great, but the economy is constantly changing, so that's not always possible. When we're at full employment, a couple of other things are true. The economy is going to be at the natural rate of unemployment, which means that the only kinds of unemployment that we have are those forms of unemployment we always have, right? People are always going to be looking for jobs, which is frictional unemployment. And jobs are always going to be like kind of going out of style or out of use, right? If you're a VCR repairman or a milkman, you're not really employed anymore. That's what we would call structural unemployment. So at this point, we still have a little bit of unemployment, but we have no cyclical unemployment, which is the unemployment associated with recessions. That's really good. If we're at an unemployment rate of like 3 to 5%, we're pretty happy with how the economy is doing. Notably, This is also when the economy is in long-run equilibrium. So if we don't do anything, this is where the economy will eventually end back up. We'll talk about that in a later unit. So again, the three places. The second place that we can be when we combine these graphs together is what's called a negative output gap or a recessionary gap. And the definition for this is when aggregate demand and aggregate supply are crossing to the left of your long-run aggregate supply. So another way of saying that, based on what this graph says, is that the current GDP, which is where aggregate supply and aggregate demand connect, right here, is less than the full employment GDP. So we can see we are right here as opposed to right here. So we are lower than full employment GDP. So at this point, a couple of things are true. Our output, the amount of stuff we're making, is less than it possibly could be. Our inflation is also going to be pretty low, but our unemployment is going to be high. It's going to be higher than the natural rate of unemployment. So if we're in this kind of situation in the economy, the seesaw between inflation and unemployment is kind of tilted towards unemployment. We're going to have a lot of people looking for work, but prices are not going to be going up very quickly. So if we are in this situation, the government's job is to increase aggregate demand. They are going to try to step on the gas of the economy and try to stimulate it so it grows and we can get back to full employment. So if we're in this kind of output gap, we want to grow the economy. We want to try to increase aggregate demand, make more stuff to lower unemployment. The other place that we can be is a positive output gap. This is also called an inflationary gap. And just like before, we can read this off of the graph. So our current state of the economy is where AD and AS cross, which means our current GDP is here. Apologies for my terrible arrow. I'm writing with a trackball. And our full employment GDP is right here. So right now, our GDP is actually above full employment, which can seem a little bit weird, but you have to remember full employment is what we can make at our maximum output sustainably. It's possible to go above that temporarily, but we're going to be overdoing it. We might be hiring too many people. We might be overdoing the amount that the factories are producing. We might not be able to sustainably continue this pace. And so if we're in an inflationary gap, that means our output is high, we're making more stuff, and our unemployment is actually going to be really low, maybe lower than we want it to be. But, which is, again, kind of weird. We're used to thinking that all unemployment is bad, but it's actually possible for unemployment to be too low for where the economy's sweet spot is. When we're in this situation, inflation is really, really high. This is where the economy has been in the past year or two, and that's one of the reasons why the government has increased interest rates so much, which is why it's kind of hard to buy a house right now. If we are in this situation, the government's goal is to decrease aggregate demand and try to get us back to full employment. So if in a negative output gap, we're stepping on the gas, here the government is actually going to try to step on the brakes. They want to slow people down and get them to produce less stuff. So that way inflation doesn't keep running so high. So those are essentially the three states that the economy can be in at any given time. And a lot of macroeconomics just comes back to this model and asking ourselves, well, what can we do to get us back to full employment? If we're not in this sweet spot in the middle right here, right? If we had it our way, the economy would always look like this. But it can't, so we have to adjust the economy and kind of nudge it back into that sweet spot. So now, putting all of this together, we can talk a little bit about what happens when you make shifts to aggregate demand and aggregate supply. We've talked about this a little bit in past units. We've talked about what the shifters of these graphs are, but now we can pull it all together and we can talk about, well, what actually happens in the economy when aggregate demand changes or when aggregate supply changes. And we do this using this model. So the way that we're going to do this, just like we've done with previous graphs, is we're going to shift the curves and read the graph to see what comes up. So for example, if we're starting here in full employment and we say that the government is going to spend $100 million to give every household a free pony, what is that going to do? Well, the first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what is shifting here? Is this going to affect aggregate supply or aggregate demand? So if we ask ourselves that, we can conclude that aggregate demand is going to shift. Because essentially, you'll remember the four shifters of aggregate demand are the components of gross domestic product: consumer spending, investment spending, government spending, and net exports. And in this case, this is definitely going to be government spending. It literally says it right in the problem. The government spends $100 million buying ponies for everybody. So we know aggregate demand is going to shift. The second question is it going to increase or decrease? And to figure this out, you just have to look at the problem and think about the situation being described. So here, well, aggregate demand is going to increase because the government is spending more money on ponies than they were before. So we know it's going to shift to the right. Our next step is simply to draw the new curve and to read off the graph what has changed. So if we shift aggregate demand to the right and draw a new curve, before we were intersecting here, and now we're intersecting here. So we can actually read off of the graph what is going to change in this situation. We know price level is going to increase, which means we're going to have inflation. And we also know that real GDP is going to increase, which means unemployment is going to decrease. Anytime real GDP is increasing, unemployment is decreasing, and vice versa. Again, apologies for my bad handwriting. I'm doing this quickly on a trackball. So what has changed? The price level increased, which means inflation went up. The economy grew, and unemployment fell. This is basically how you're going to do all of these problems. You're going to figure out what graph is shifting. You're going to figure out what direction it's shifting. You're going to shift the graph, and then you're just going to read the graph to find the answers. It's pretty simple. So another example. Consumer spending falls by $250 million. What happens to all of these things? Real GDP, unemployment, inflation. So again, we're going to start from our full employment. We're not always going to start on full employment. Some questions will tell you we're starting in an inflationary gap or we're starting in a recessionary gap. So you have to kind of pay attention to what the question's asking to know where our starting point is. But for this one, we're just going to say we're in full employment. So same deal, we ask ourselves these three questions. So you might want to take a second and pause the video here, see if you can figure this out, sketch it out for yourself, and then you can come check your answers with me. So in this situation, we're going to have an aggregate demand decrease because consumer spending is one of the four parts of real GDP, C, consumer spending. So aggregate demand would decrease. And you can see off of the graph here that this would cause a price level decrease. We can see the decrease here, and a real GDP decrease here, which means unemployment is going to go up. So in this new situation, we're in a recessionary gap. And we can extend this one step further. We can ask ourselves, well, what can the government do to fix this problem? We know that if unemployment is high, the government needs to step on the gas. They need to stimulate the economy, which means the government needs to do something that's going to increase aggregate demand. In later lessons in this unit, we're going to figure out what they can do to step on the gas. That's kind of another topic. For today, we're just focusing on how we can do these shifts. So to practice here, and again, you can practice along with this video if you'd like, I'm going to give you 10 scenarios. For each one of them, you're going to want to draw an ADAS graph and use it to figure out what is shifting and how is this going to change the economy. So here are your 10 scenarios. You can pause here for a second and work through these. Dun, 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 dun. And now that you've practiced, you can see what the answers are going to be. So these are your answers for those practice questions. And there you go. That's 3.5 and 3.6. It's not too complicated, but it's kind of the glue that holds this whole unit together. So It's very important you kind of understand how these graphs all link up, because we use this as our model for the rest of the class to represent how the whole country's economy is doing. So not too complicated, but very, very important. That's all I got. I will see you all next time.